Why do you think, leaders are kind of reluctant to act or do as they say?
On controversial issues?
Yes.
Well, I think, there is solidarity amongst heads of state on a number of things. There are shared points of view. There are different arguments about democracy versus stability that people will use. Are elections really a measure of democracy, or are there other things you could look at? So there isn't necessarily consensus, I think, on things like elections or mandates. But there should be consensus on things like human rights. A human rights violation is a human rights violation. Really, it's a basic fact. And I think that we can use those facts to try and get some action, some positive action from our leadership. We don't enough. That's the truth. And in some countries, people aren't free to vote for who they would like to have in office. And then, of course, presidents are able to abuse that power. So there are still varying different views on some key issues on the continent, which is, again, why the African Union can play an important role. In making sure that civilians don't get caught in these political power grabs that we so often see, because that's what happens. We see the civilians, and the numbers of deaths, the numbers of displaced, the numbers of missing, the numbers of kidnapped rise and rise and rise, while the political will is not there to do something.
Civil society, what role should civil society play?
Well, I think the role of civil society is to act as a watchdog, and to try and push for improvement on governance in countries where that is an issue, improvement on human rights. It's an alternative voice. Its job is to call attention to issues that aren't paid attention to by government, to advocate for people who can't necessarily do it on their own, and to keep issues that are important in the forefront, whether that's the media or a civil society organization or an advocacy organization or a human rights organization. That's what they do. They keep reminding us of what we need to know about what's happening in our countries or our continent. And I think that in some cases they do tremendously courageous work. In Burundi, we have a very strong civil society. Unfortunately, many of them now in exile, pushed into exile as a result of people being threatened and in many instances also killed or physically injured. But that is a strong civil society. There was also very strong media there. And it played an important role. But at the end of the day, if the government wants to employ force against those entities, then there's nothing civil society can do.
What should be business's role?
I think business has to be aware of the environment in which it operates. If you're a large company and you're an international company and you're operating in a country like, for example, the DRC, you need to be aware of the political surroundings that you're operating in, of the level of corruption and power peddling that goes on. You can't go into such a situation blindly and then throw your hands up and say you didn't know because you're the private sector. Private sector makes deals with government for mining access and so on and so forth. So you can hold the government to certain standards. And I think, especially with companies that have shareholders, that they are accountable to their shareholders. And so there is pressure, there is leverage. And in many cases, companies have chosen not to get involved in countries that are very controversial. But I do think business could be playing a bigger role in just trying to clean up private sector in Africa, whether that's domestic or international business. That's a tall order. And it's not their job alone. And I think that's also the other side of the debate. Often the private sector that does operate in difficult zones gets fingers pointed at it, even though it's not necessarily done anything wrong. I think it comes from both sides. But business has an important role to play. It's investment, it's economic growth, it's jobs. It's important, so it has to be a player in the conversation.
Could be, but are they?
It depends. I think we have to look at different sectors. I think we have to look at different countries. I think that the business practices that we're aware of that aren't always transparent are still very prevalent, too prevalent. But I do think there's been some improvement. We have some international standards about how business can operate. The United States has very strict standards. Other countries have very strict standards. They're not always applied as much as they should be. But there is a cognizance that the operating environment and the interaction between the operating environment and the business is important and should be scrutinized. But more can be done, there's no question about that.
Well, on a scale of 1 to 5, where are we as a continent, in terms of, conflict and violence and how it affects human rights?
Oh, that's a difficult one. 1 to 10, I'd say we're probably at about a 6.5. But we certainly see a lot of recurring conflict and a lot of conflicts we thought had perhaps been resolved that have now relapsed, notably South Sudan, but also Burundi, and the Great Lakes region at large, the conflict in DRC never having been fully resolved, ongoing political tensions with the opposition in Rwanda, no open conflict, but concerns there. And then, of course, West Africa has a number of challenges as a result of the terrorist activities there and their influence on national politics. So still some quite active conflict zones there. The Central African Republic, although it has gone through the first round of voting, it is still in a state of conflict at this stage, and there's much work to be done. Then, of course, we have Boko Haram, very active in Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Cameroon, and growing. We have Somalia that has been in a state of conflict for a very long time. So we have a number of quite protracted situations and conflict systems that have not been really resolved and that continue to flare up, and then some new ones.
Do we really have what it takes to actually deal with the problems?
I mean, we have some very standard peacekeeping tools that we tend to employ in situations where there's been a protracted conflict and then some kind of political settlement. We tend to deploy African Union peacekeeping forces or UN peacekeeping forces, costly and logistically difficult. Sometimes they are successful, and often they're not. I think our toolbox has become perhaps a little bit outdated. And so we're not able to prevent violence as much as we should be able to. We're not able to prevent escalation of conflict even once political settlements have been made. We're not able to prevent a backsliding. In South Sudan we had a UN mission and we had elections, and then we had several years later the disintegration of a government and a return to civil war. We've seen a similar situation in eastern DRC or in DRC as a whole, where since 2001 there's been a UN mission and we still don't have peace in the eastern DRC. Burundi too had a UN peacekeeping mission and very involved regional actors playing a role there, including South Africa, and today we find ourselves worrying again that it may go back to civil war. So I think we need to think out of the box a little bit more, and I think that we need to also look at situations much earlier than we do. And we need to also really be tough on leaders in these countries where we see crackdowns on human rights and a tightening of the political space. Often those are the first signs that perhaps conflict could follow.
What do we need? What is missing from that toolbox?
I think, a deterrent factor in the African Union could perhaps play a very important role there. I mean, we have this continental body that has grown stronger in the last decade and is taking some bold steps, notably in Burundi. But we still face, at the end of the day, the will of the heads of state, of the member states. Will they vote for the deployment of a force to Burundi, or will they worry about the precedent that could set for intervention in their own affairs? I think we need to have better standards. We need better norms in Africa. We had, 20 years ago, a lot of coups happening, and different responses to those coups by the then Organization of African Unity. Today we've moved on. A coup is a coup. It's illegitimate. You get kicked out of the AU if you do that. We need to apply those kinds of sanctions and those kinds of rigorous responses on other levels. Human rights violations, attacks by security forces on civilians, those types of things. We really need to improve those standards, and clearly the African Union is the body that can gradually try and enforce that change and create that change also at the level of the heads of state, hopefully.
Well, are Africa's heads of state actually doing that?
I think it depends on you're looking at. I mean, South Africa, of course, should and could and has, in some instances, played a really leading role on moral issues on the continent. It's the most stable democracy, I would argue. Many would argue. We have other examples in Southern Africa, of course, Botswana, that is very stable as well. But I think South Africa can exert moral leadership and can lead by example. And so it's countries like that need to take bold action. I think Nigeria, having just been through a remarkable change internally, and we're all hoping that Buhari continues to clean up corruption in his country and really does take good governance as seriously as he says he intends to, that would make an even stronger Nigeria. And so those are the countries that I think need to lead. Others can do it too, but I think we do need those big countries economically, morally, and also also in some cases with peacekeeping capacity, of course, to take the lead and to speak clearly about what they think should be the standards that we need to aim for in the future across the continent.
Well, the tight race for the member states of the African Union, Vision 2020, all guns must be silenced in the next 4 years. Whether that will happen, we will wait and see. After the break, we